The issue has come up a lot in this presidential campaign. Is it possible to be too old to run for president? And if so, are Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden too old to run for president? Either one of them is older than Donald Trump. Either one of them would be the oldest elected president in American history. There's been a lot of discussion around this, and my next guest has written a very interesting op-ed about it. Zaid Jilani is a writer I've known and whose work I've followed for a long time. He is currently, however, a writing fellow at the Bridging the Divides project at UC Berkeley's Greater Good Science Center, but he's written about politics and related issues for quite a while. He also has a podcast called Extremely Offline that brings together guests with very opposing points of view to try to well, I'll let him describe it if he cares to. So first of all, Zaid, thanks for coming on the program.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Good to talk to you again. And I appreciate it. I've been involved in some sort of private arguments and debates about this question of whether someone can be, whether Bernie Sanders in particular and Joe Biden are too old to be president. So I was pleased to see you weigh in on this issue. I'm tempted to be flippant and say I'm hoping they're not too old because I want to, think that that's something I might do when I grow up. But it's actually a serious issue, and I think that's the point you make in your op-ed that a lot of the criticism of Bernie and Biden, that's the age-related criticism, is really a form of prejudice, a bit bigotry, isn't it?
Yeah, so I think that, people make mental shortcuts in their heads all the time. You make a generalization, you associate certain things with certain things, and sometimes that can make sense. So for instance, if you're going to travel to the city of Seattle in April, it's probably a good idea to bring an umbrella. Even if you don't know exactly what the weather's going to be like, that's a stereotype you have in your mind about, it's very rainy in Seattle, especially in the spring, so I should bring an umbrella. But it gets a little bit tougher when we start applying these to individuals. Because, it can lead us to prejudicial thinking where we're judging someone without really knowing who they are. And it's really interesting. There's a lab at Harvard, or it's affiliated with Harvard, that studies various types of bias and prejudice. And what they found is that in many different areas, that prejudice has been declining over the past, I think they've studied since back to 2007 towards the present. They've seen that there's been declining bias around race. There's been declining bias around sexuality, so we're much more accepting of LGBT people than we used to be. But one area where they haven't seen much change is around age. In our society, people tend to have certain stereotypes about the elderly. And by the way, that's something that's true across the board with age. The elderly also have certain stereotypes about elderly. And I think that, a lot of times when we think about, for instance, when we talk about Bernie Sanders or Joe Biden's age, we say maybe they're too old to be president. Pete Buttigieg has said in numerous occasions that he's for generational change. He represents generational change, which is kind of subtle to get the same message. I think a lot of that comes from the fact that people are associating certain things with being old. You're slowing down mentally. You're less physically competent. The presidency is a very demanding job. You have to be kind of, at the top of your class in terms of being president. And they think, well, if somebody's very old, maybe they can't be. But the thing is that age fundamentally is like, it's a number. It's the amount of time you've been on planet Earth. But it doesn't necessarily have to correlate to any of those other things. You can be quite old and in great shape. You can be quite young and in poor shape. People who are top-tier presidential candidates often do physical exams. They can also demonstrate mental competency in certain ways. You can look at the campaign schedule that Bernie Sanders is following and see that he is very much, I've seen him in the Capitol running around, and sometimes I think that he could probably outrun me, and I'm 31 years old. So I think that, it's worth thinking about our own biases in these respects. I mean, when you think, okay, this is an old man, maybe they have all these problems, you should try to evaluate that. Like, what is the evidence for that? Judge them as individuals rather than as some sort of archetype of what you imagine the age to be.
Yeah, and I think you do a great job of making that case in your CNN op-ed, but I think it gets to the question of how broadly and how deeply do we want to enrich our understanding of the forms of bigotry that exist in the world? That do we want to say, for example, that well, I don't want to say demonizing, dismissing older people as being less than mentally competent, less than physically capable, without evidence, is in fact another way that we put people into a stereotype and fail to, and by doing so, fail to allow them to reach their full potential at any point in their lives. Do you get what I'm driving at?
Yeah, and it's interesting in that we wrote the op-ed in the context of the presidential race in terms of the politics, but it does apply across the board. So, for instance, there's some really good research about the elderly in our workplace. That oftentimes, when people make disparaging remarks, calling someone a geezer, implying their age is kind of slowing them down in some regards, that it does tend to have a long-term impact on people who are elderly in the workplace. They might leave their jobs early. It might harm their performance, or just harm their kind of work satisfaction. So these have consequences across our society. And I think it's interesting in the Harvard study that I cited earlier and that I've written about. That was in an American context, and I'd be really curious to see if this context holds across the world. In that, I think that the cultural context that my parents come from, they come from, Indian subcontinent, South Asia. Generally, the elderly are held in higher regard. Even within the structure of language, sometimes you give them different honorifics for being older. They're generally thought of as wiser. Some Eastern religions particularly very much value someone who's like, the Buddha, very old. It's associated with wisdom. And I'm really, really curious if there's actually a cultural kind of context here that in the West, we tend to very much value youth. We see it as vibrance, as having energy, et cetera, et cetera. And maybe in the East, it's a little bit different. But I think that the American context in particular, particularly with how it's so visual, because a lot of our biases kick in when we look at somebody. I think it's very famous now that the Nixon-Kennedy debate between JFK and Nixon created a totally different dynamic in our politics that didn't exist before then, is that people didn't think very much about candidates' looks, their age, the way they talk, the way that they sort of physically demonstrate themselves, because we didn't have televised debates before that. And so I think there is something almost uniquely American going on here with age as well, which is that when we have to deconstruct this bias, we have to understand that it's kind of taking part in a cultural context that I think sometimes really fetishizes youth, to where somebody like Pete Buttigieg can be openly and externally sort of promoting that as an asset to his campaign, and that we don't necessarily value age in some of the ways and the wisdom that comes with that in some ways that other societies do.
Well, I think it's a really interesting point, and I think it also, you put it in terms of geography and space, also might be true in time, too. It would be interesting to go back the JFK-Nixon debate. Remember, when JFK won that election, he then said in his inaugural speech, let the word go out to friend and foe alike, that a torch has been passed to a new generation. But he was being very specific that the generation that fought World War II, which was at that point still in early adulthood, was now taking over. It was a generational shift. It was basically a way of saying these old guys like Truman and Eisenhower and even Roosevelt, had he lived, they're over and we're taking over. It's new vibrancy. It would be interesting to know whether, for example, in the first half of the 20th century, this same sort of bias against older people existed in politics or in popular culture or in the workplace, or if it's something that developed in this post-war era.
That's very interesting. Yeah, that would be a very interesting thing to study. I'm not sure if we could study it to the depth that we do, in that, for instance, what Harvard studies bias, they use both implicit and explicit tests. And a lot of that research and that methodology was developed fairly recently, although we could maybe use opinion surveys back in the day asking, do you factor a candidate's age? Does it matter to you? Does youth matter to you? Does being an older person, an elderly person matter to you? But yeah, I think that would be a really, really interesting question to ask, because one of the things we know is that cultures don't stay stable over time. They obviously what they value, shared value, what their expectations change a lot over time. So I think that would be a really interesting question to study.
Yeah, I do too. And again, we're talking with Zaid Jilani about his editorial about ageism in the presidential campaign. And by the way, Zaid, I've had people tell me that since my show goes out on Free Speech TV, that I should not leave my hair white, that I should dye it or something. And I just, I don't know why. I don't want to do that. But I do know other broadcasters my age and older, and they seem to all, male broadcasters, they seem to all dye their hair. So I think there is this perception that the instant analysis that occurs without people even thinking about it is skewed against older people. What can we do about it, if anything? And particularly in politics, it concerns me because I think it's being used. My personal feeling, but I'd be interested in your thoughts about it. My personal feeling is that it's maybe being used to stifle debate about the issues themselves. That it's very easy to say, I represent a new generation, I'm Beto, or I'm Pete Buttigieg, or I'm whomever, so I don't have to put my ideas up against a Bernie Sanders or even a Joe Biden's and say why they're better. It seems to me like a superficial pitch, but maybe I'm being unfair to those guys. I don't know.
I mean, I think even going beyond the issues of, are we going to discuss issues or are we going to discuss ideas or policies, it's also a matter of records. I think that if you're somebody like Pete Buttigieg, I mean, you've certainly been mayor of South Bend. You served in the armed services. I mean, certainly these are credentials, but they tend to be fairly thin credentials for somebody running for president. Usually, if you're running for president, you want to at least be a U.S. senator or a governor. Of course, President Trump was an extremely unusual example in that regard, in that he didn't have government experience before. But typically, those are the paths that you take. So I think in terms of, for instance, Mayor Pete, very strongly suggesting that, he represents generational change. He uses that word over and over. It is kind of a way to sidestep the reality that he doesn't necessarily have the same experience as someone like a Bernie Sanders or a Joe Biden or even Elizabeth Warren. At other times, he said he doesn't necessarily think voters want to get into the minutia of policy, right? I do think it is something that is used in that regard because there is a segment of voters who do value experience and who do value having that record and that a demonstration that you've been on these issues for many years, and he doesn't have that. So I think to some extent, the generational pitch probably is being used as a substitute for that. But I think it's important that when people hear that language, that they also come to think to themselves, well, is it really that important to have a president of a certain age, right? It matters what the president does, how they administer the government. Do they do it competently? Do they make you feel proud about your country in terms of the values they represent? Do they pass policies that benefit Americans and people elsewhere? I mean, I think that's the actual job of the president, right? Because I think in terms of, like I said, there is an American bias towards youth. Maybe it will give you a sort of momentary psychological comfort to have somebody who's younger there on the television giving speeches, talking to crowds, meeting with voters. There is, I think, some amount of comfort there, but I think you have to recognize that if you hold that against another candidate who doesn't have that age, but who can do the job just as competently, if not better, that could end up being a form of prejudice. And, we don't want to have that determining our elections, rather than having elections that are about much more, kind of noble, high-minded things. Like, for instance, what's that person's record? What is how have they demonstrated themselves in government, and what are their plans for the future? What will they actually do when they get there? Because that's ultimately what matters and counts over the long term. I think the fact that, JFK was quite young was maybe quite appealing for a lot of people. I think it maybe made them feel good temporarily. But ultimately, his legacy, Voting Rights Act, that was his legacy, right? His policy agenda was it. And I think that is where we should be trying to focus ourselves when we watch these debates and when we see these candidates out, even on our television screens, where I think is a place where, being a little younger, a little more, having more vitality and energy definitely helps you, fairly or unfairly.
Yeah, I certainly agree, and I feel that this is such an important conversation to have a sort of wrap up from my end for two reasons. One, the political, because we want to have a political discourse based on substantive issues, not on relatively superficial ones or those that allow people to elide the issues. And secondly, because I think it's a teachable moment. It's a moment when people can perhaps come to understand that the kind of thinking they've been bringing to politics, they may be bringing to other aspects of their lives, the workplace or community activism or whatever, where they are dismissing people because of their age, and the opportunity to learn what's wrong about that form of thinking and improve, which all of us should always be in the process of doing. But I will leave the last word for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that last part was really important. I think one of the errors that people make is they think, okay, you're a kid, you're growing up, eventually you become an adult, you kind of know everything, you can't really change or improve at that point. But that's not true. The reality is throughout the course of people's entire lives, they tend to change and age in and out of various things. And that is not any different for people who are older and elderly. I think even Bernie Sanders, in terms of the way that he's addressing his politics now, has shown an ability to have the vitality and the energy and the flexibility to be involved in politics that's constantly changing. And, I don't think there's an argument to be made for or against a candidate based purely on their age. People may associate various things with age. They may think, well, this person is inflexible in their thinking because they're so old. Well, I think instead of using the age as a proxy, which could lead us to make mental errors, lead us to make assumptions, why not just see if that person's flexible? Why not just see what ideas they're talking about? And I think ultimately, I ended the CNN piece with this. In 2016, Bernie Sanders got more votes from young people than Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton combined in the presidential primaries. That showed that America's young people, may be able to overcome this bias. They may say this person doesn't look like us, he doesn't talk like us. Maybe he's not easy on the eyes. Some people say some of the candidates are more physically appealing, but this person was speaking to our values, and this person had 30 or 40 year long record of speaking to our values and demonstrating that consistently. And so we're for this person. If so many people were able to overcome that bias, then that does speak well to the reality that we could eventually, move this bias down in our society, just as we move down bias towards gay and lesbian Americans, towards minority ethnic groups, so on and so forth. So.
All right. Well, I think that's a great observation, and I thank you for writing this piece, a great contribution to this debate, which is of great interest to me on ageism. And thanks, Zaid Jilani, for coming on the program.
Yeah, thank you.